It all started with a notification on my phone as I casually browsed Facebook Marketplace. A photo of an antique sofa caught my eye. It was a Victorian-style piece with intricately carved wood and red velvet upholstery, the kind of furniture you'd expect to see in luxury home decor magazines. But what truly grabbed my attention was the price, only $50. It seemed unreal that something so elegant was being sold for such a low price. The description read, "Antique sofa. Needs to go fast. First to pick it up gets it." There was no mention of damage or flaws. It felt as though the seller was desperate to get rid of it. I decided to send a message. "Is it still available?" I asked. Almost immediately I got a reply. "Yes, but it needs to be picked up today." We agreed that I'd collect it after work. The address was in a remote neighborhood on a quiet street where old, spaced-out houses lined the road. When I arrived, the house was shrouded in darkness save for a dim light on the porch. I knocked on the door and an elderly man answered. He seemed jittery, avoiding eye contact as he led me to the garage. There it was, the sofa, as majestic as it had looked in the photo, though covered in a fine layer of dust. "Is there anything wrong with it?" I asked, trying to understand why someone would sell such a beautiful piece for so little. "It's perfect," the man replied quickly, almost cutting me off. He seemed eager to end the interaction. "Just take it, please." Something about his tone unsettled me, but I chalked it up to exhaustion or urgency. The sofa was heavy, and he didn't even offer to help load it into my truck. Once it was secured, he handed me a folded piece of paper. "Read this when you get home," he said before shutting the door without waiting for a response. On the drive back, curiosity about the note gnawed at me, but I decided to wait. When I got home, I set the sofa in the living room and sat down, admiring it. It gave the room a completely different vibe, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I remembered the paper. Unfolding it, I saw shaky handwriting. "Be cautious. Never sleep on the sofa. Never leave it alone for too long." The message was unsettling, yet it also felt absurd. Laughing nervously, I dismissed it as an old man's eccentric warning. After all, a piece of furniture couldn't be dangerous. That night, as I finished arranging the room, a faint creaking sound caught my attention. It was subtle, like the groan of something shifting. I glanced at the sofa and for a moment thought it looked different, as if its position had changed slightly. Shaking my head, I pushed the ridiculous thought aside. I was tired, and exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. I decided to head to bed, but with each step away from the living room, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I shut the bedroom door behind me, but the faint creaking continued, this time closer. The tension in the air was thick, and my heartbeat quickened with every second. Then it stopped, right outside my door. The silence was deafening. The silence that followed that creak was unbearable. My heart was pounding so loudly that for a moment I feared it could be heard outside the door. I stood frozen, torn between opening the door and waiting for dawn to arrive. Then came the sound. A soft scratching like nails slowly dragging across the wooden surface of my bedroom door. My breath caught and a cold sweat trickled down my neck. Gripping my phone, I turned on the flashlight and moved cautiously, searching for something to use as a weapon. The only thing within reach was an old iron bar I kept by the dresser. I grabbed it, mustering what little courage I had, and prepared to open the door. When I finally turned the knob, the door creaked as it opened. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating an empty hallway. I took a deep breath and stepped outside, but the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched clung to me. My attention turned to the living room. The faint light from the window reflected off the sofa's surface. Something seemed different, but my mind was too scrambled to pinpoint exactly what. As I stepped into the living room, the air felt heavier, almost charged. The sofa, once elegant and inviting, now exuded an almost menacing presence. It was as if it were watching me. And then I saw it. On the armrest of the sofa were deep, fresh scratch marks, as if claws had scraped across the fabric. I froze. This didn't make sense. No one else was in the house. I tried to rationalize it, but the growing dread consumed me. I couldn't ignore the note anymore. I returned to the kitchen where I had left it, reading it over and over. Be cautious. Never sleep on the sofa. Never leave it alone for too long. What did it mean? Why would someone write such a thing? Then the living room light flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room. One shadow for a split second seemed to move independently of the light, enough to make my stomach churn. And then it happened. The sofa moved. Not dramatically, but one of its legs scraped against the floor, as if something inside it were trying to get out. Panic surged through me. There was no rational explanation for what I was seeing. I grabbed my car keys, deciding I needed to leave the house immediately. But as I turned toward the door, the light flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. In the gloom, I heard a guttural sound, low and unnatural, coming directly from the sofa. My entire body locked up in fear. The last thing I saw before bolting out the door was the fabric of the sofa stretching slightly, as if something inside was pressing against it. I ran to my car and didn't look back. Only when I was miles away, parked at an empty gas station, did I call the local police. My explanation was incoherent. I rambled about something being wrong with the piece of furniture I'd purchased. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical, but assured me they'd send someone to check it out. The next day I received a call. The police had found the sofa. It was empty, but inside the upholstery they discovered scratches that resembled claw marks and stains of dried blood. They asked where I had gotten it, and I gave them the address. Later I learned that the house where I had picked up the sofa had been sold by a family years earlier after a tragedy. One of their members had disappeared, and the body was never found. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I never returned to that house, nor do I want to know what became of the sofa. But even now, I sometimes feel as though I'm being watched, as if something came with me that night. What I'm about to share is something I'll never forget. It was supposed to be just another quick visit to an old property up for sale. As a real estate agent, I was used to dealing with aged houses, full of quirks and history. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that afternoon. The house was in an old neighborhood where towering trees lined the streets, their branches casting shadows that nearly blocked out the sun. Its facade exuded neglect, loose boards, dusty windows, and an eerie stillness. The property came with whispers of disappearances, strange noises, and a string of owners who always left in a hurry, selling the place for next to nothing. To me, they were just exaggerated tales. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was overcast, and the cold wind made the scene even more desolate. As arranged, the key was in a small lockbox on the front porch. As I climbed the creaky wooden steps, a chill ran down my spine. It felt as though someone or something was watching me. When I unlocked the door, a pungent mix of mold and something sweet, almost sickly, hit my nose. The interior felt frozen in time. Heavy wooden furniture, faded wallpaper, and ancient curtains drooping like ghosts. Each step I took made the floorboards groan, the sound echoing through the empty house. I began my usual routine, taking photos, jotting down notes on repairs, and examining the details for the listing. But as I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, everything began to change. The stairs were steep, each step eliciting a shrill, almost human-like creak. At the top, a dimly lit hallway stretched out, lined with slightly ajar doors, except for one at the very end, which was shut tight. A shiver ran through me, but I pressed on. The first room I entered held nothing remarkable: a dusty bed, an open wardrobe, and peeling wallpaper. But the second room was different. There, near the window, sat a porcelain doll on a wooden chair. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. The lace on its yellow dress was delicate, and its cracked smile was eerily lifelike, almost mocking. I stood frozen, entranced by its gaze, until a muffled sound snapped me back. It was faint but unmistakable, movement coming from the hallway. I stepped out quickly and scanned the corridor, but it was empty. The sensation of being watched intensified. Brushing it off, I moved to the next room. As soon as I entered, an icy chill enveloped me. The window was shut, but the temperature was noticeably lower. The wallpaper was torn in places, exposing strange marks scratched into the wood beneath, deep grooves that resembled claw marks. And then I heard it. A soft, childlike giggle echoed faintly from the hallway. My heart stopped. I rushed to look, but the hallway was still empty. Except now, the door at the end of the corridor, the one that had been firmly shut, was slightly ajar. A morbid curiosity urged me forward, but every instinct screamed for me to leave. Still, I found myself walking toward the door. Slowly, I pushed it open. The room was barren, save for a gently rocking chair in the center, swaying as though someone had just stood up. On the floor lay another porcelain doll, identical to the one in the previous room. This one was toppled over, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, a jagged crack splitting its face. Before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, the giggle came again, closer, right beside me. I bolted. Racing down the stairs, I stumbled, nearly falling. When I reached the front door, I felt a strange weight on my back, as though something was chasing me. I flung the door open and leapt off the porch, diving into my car. As I sped away, I made the mistake of glancing in the rearview mirror. In the window of the second floor, a small silhouette stood watching me leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. The laughter echoed in my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that doll's fractured smile. Even now, the memory lingers, unshakable, like a shadow that never quite leaves. The days following my first visit to that house were plagued by insomnia and paranoia. The feeling of being watched never left me, and the muffled sound of the laughter I had heard seemed to echo in my mind during every moment of silence. The memory of the doll's glassy eyes continued to haunt me, as if its presence had etched itself into my soul. Even so, I decided I needed to return. It was my responsibility as a real estate agent to understand what was happening in that house. I invited my colleague Mark to come with me. He laughed at my story, treating it as an exaggeration, but agreed to accompany me, perhaps to prove that I was imagining things. That gray morning, as we parked in front of the house, a wave of familiar discomfort washed over me. The gloomy facade looked even heavier under the overcast sky. I explained what had happened as I unlocked the door, but Mark seemed more interested in mocking my fears. The smell of mold and that oppressive air greeted us once more. As we climbed the stairs, my heart raced, but I tried to remain calm. We started with the second room, where I had seen the doll during my previous visit. To my surprise and horror, the chair was empty. Maybe it went for a stroll, Mark joked, trying to lighten the mood, but his tone revealed his own discomfort. We searched the room but found nothing. When we entered the third room, the temperature dropped immediately, and the scratch marks on the walls seemed more recent and deeper. That's when Mark froze. "This is, strange," he said, pointing to the doll now leaning against the wall, its cracked face and even more unsettling smile. It wasn't the same doll from the second room. It was the one from the rocking chair at the end of the hallway. Before we could react, we heard light, quick footsteps in the hallway, followed by the sound of a child's laughter. Mark ran into the hallway, shouting, "Who's there?" But the space was empty except for the door at the end of the hallway, which was now shut. "This time you open it," he said, clearly nervous. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for the rocking chair, now motionless. On the floor, a framed photo lay next to the chair. I picked it up cautiously, and what I saw made me freeze. It was an old black and white photograph of a girl holding the doll. Behind her stood a couple who seemed to be her parents, both with somber, uneasy expressions. In the lower corner of the photo, the date read 1927. Suddenly, the sound of the rocking chair creaked through the room. It began to move slowly, as if someone were sitting in it. I dropped the photo, and Mark and I exchanged terrified glances. Without a word, we decided it was time to leave. We ran down the stairs, but before we reached the door, the laughter echoed again, this time louder, almost deafening, reverberating throughout the house. We sprinted outside, jumped into the car, and drove away without looking back. On the way home, Mark, pale and visibly shaken, turned to me. "You were right. Something is seriously wrong with that house." After that day, I categorically refused to work on that property again. I don't know what happened in that house or what those dolls truly represent. Perhaps they guard a dark secret, or perhaps they are the result of some evil that occurred there. Today, even far away, I still wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I hear that laughter echoing in the silence. Something tells me that somehow the house and its dolls are still connected to me, patiently waiting for my return. But one thing is certain: I will never give them that chance. My name is Jake, and I have always been fascinated by mystery stories. As a freelance writer, I often spend hours in libraries and antique fairs looking for inspiration for my tales. It was at one of these fairs, held in an abandoned warehouse in rural Tennessee, that I found the cabinet. The place was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, illuminated by dim, flickering lights hanging from the ceiling. Every corner was crammed with old furniture, dusty books, and decorative objects forgotten by time. My gaze wandered aimlessly until something caught my attention in an almost hidden corner. It was a dark wooden cabinet with ornate doors and intricate carvings that seemed to tell their own story. The wood was worn, but the carved figures, human faces and abstract shapes, were incredibly detailed, as if frozen in time. The strangest part was the oval mirror in the center of the left door. Although dusty, its reflection appeared distorted, like still water being disturbed. "Interested?" a woman asked from behind me, making me jump. She was the shop owner, a middle-aged woman with a tense smile. "Yes, it's unique," I replied, trying to sound casual as my gaze remained fixed on the cabinet. "You're brave. No one's asked about it in years," she said, adjusting her apron and looking at the furniture with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Why?" I asked, now more intrigued. "Rumors, of course. They say the previous owner disappeared, vanished without a trace," she said, laughing nervously. "But it's just a story. Want to take it? I'll give you a great price." Her words echoed in my mind, but the truth was, I was already sold on it. Strange stories like that were exactly what I was looking for. I didn't hesitate to pay for the piece, and within a few hours the cabinet was in my apartment, occupying a corner of the living room. That night, something felt different about the atmosphere. Perhaps it was the imposing presence of the cabinet, which seemed to draw all attention in the room. I decided to clean it and try to open the doors, but to my surprise, they were locked. There was no key, nor any visible hinges. The mirror in the center caught my attention again. This time it seemed clearer, as if it reflected something that wasn't exactly my apartment. I can't explain it, but I had the unsettling feeling of being watched. Ignoring the sensation, I went back to my bedroom, planning to explore the cabinet the next day. But in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a sound that sent chills down my spine. A low creak, like wooden doors slowly opening on their own. I got up slowly, my heart racing, and walked through the dark house to the living room. The moonlight partially illuminated the room, and there it was, the cabinet, with one of its doors slightly ajar. I approached cautiously, trying to find a rational explanation. But when I looked into the mirror, something made me step back. My reflection wasn't there. Instead, I saw a dark, empty room on the other side, as if the mirror was a window into another place. I swallowed hard and quickly shut the cabinet door. But the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered. At that moment, I realized that I might have brought home much more than just an antique piece of furniture. The next night arrived quickly, but sleep did not. Since the incident with the mirror, an unsettling feeling lingered in the apartment. Even during the day, the wardrobe seemed to dominate the room, as if its presence extended beyond the physical boundaries of the furniture. I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a screwdriver, I resolved to examine every inch of the wardrobe. My gut told me the secret was hidden behind those locked doors. The problem was, they remained shut tight with no visible way to open them. If I can't open it, maybe I can dismantle it, I murmured to myself, forcing a smile that didn't fool even me. I began inspecting the furniture, searching for screws or a hidden mechanism. When I shone the light on the bottom of the wardrobe, I noticed something peculiar. Scratch marks on the floor. The wardrobe had been moved recently, but I knew I hadn't done it. A shiver ran down my spine. I must be imagining things, I thought. I stood to grab a sturdier tool, but was interrupted by an unexpected sound. It was a faint sigh, as if someone were on the other side of the mirror. I spun toward the wardrobe, which remained still. The mirror reflected only my living room, but the feeling of being watched was almost tangible. Taking a deep breath, I approached. My fingers traced the carved frame, pressing each corner in hopes of triggering some hidden mechanism. When I touched one of the carved faces at the top, something clicked. The doors slowly swung open, revealing an interior unlike anything I'd anticipated. There were no shelves, no clothes, none of the typical contents of a wardrobe. Instead, it was an empty space with wooden walls covered in strange symbols. The floor was speckled with burn marks and melted wax, as if candles had been burned there. At the center of the space was a small chest, as old-looking as the wardrobe itself. I lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. Placing it on the table, I noticed it was secured with a sturdy padlock. As I examined the lock, the apartment lights flickered. The sensation of being watched returned with full force. An invisible presence seemed to circle the room, drawing closer with each passing second. "I need to end this now," I muttered, hastily working to open the lock. Using the screwdriver, I forced it, and with a loud snap, it gave way. Inside the chest was something unexpected. An old journal, its pages stained and worn with age. I opened it with trembling hands and began to read. The words, scrawled in jagged handwriting, described strange rituals, attempts to open portals, and a list of names. It was when I reached the final page that my heart stopped. There, written in red ink, was my name, accompanied by the word "marked." A heavy sound echoed through the room. It was the groan of the mirror, which now showed something much clearer. The reflection was no longer my living room, but a dark void where shadows shifted. At the center, a humanoid figure began to take shape, moving closer to the glass. I rushed to close the wardrobe doors, but they wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, and the acrid smell of burning filled the space. Whatever was in the mirror was coming through. Without thinking, I grabbed the journal and threw it into the wardrobe, slamming the doors shut with all my strength. To my surprise, they gave way and closed with a deafening bang. Silence returned, but the room felt cold and lifeless. I spent the entire night sitting on the floor, staring at the wardrobe, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I called a removal company to take the wardrobe away. They did so without asking questions, and I made sure I would never see or hear about that piece of furniture again. Even so, every time I see a mirror, I feel as though something is watching me from the other side, waiting for another chance to return. My name is Claire, and I was just another college student in the 1970s with dreams and worries typical of a young woman trying to build her future. Back then, the world felt less dangerous, even with occasional news of horrific crimes that seemed far removed from my reality. I lived in a small college town in Washington State, sharing a modest apartment with my friend Lisa. Life was simple, marked by classes, part-time jobs, and the rare moments of fun. It was a spring morning, and the campus was bustling with students soaking in the sunshine after months of cold. That was the day I first saw him. He stood out, someone who seemed oddly out of place in the crowd. Tall, with impeccably combed brown hair and a smile that appeared genuinely kind. He had his arm in a sling and was carrying a few books, which immediately caught my attention. I was in the library flipping through a book on modern literature when he approached me. "Excuse me," he said, "but could you help me with these books? My arm's broken and I'm having a hard time putting them back on the shelf." It was such a simple, unassuming request that I had no reason to doubt him. He seemed pleasant, the kind of person you'd imagine being invited over for a family dinner. Of course, I helped him. As we shelved the books, he asked about my academic interests and offered subtle compliments that felt sincere. "You seem really smart. What's your name?" he asked. I told him, and he smiled. thanking me for my help before leaving with polite grace. After that encounter, I didn't think much of him. He was just another friendly face in the sea of students. College life was filled with fleeting interactions, and I carried on with my routine. A few days later, whispers started circulating around campus about a disappearance. A young woman named Linda had vanished without a trace. Linda was known for being responsible and punctual, and her absence sent ripples of unease through the student body. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine, but I quickly brushed off the thought that anything sinister could happen in our quiet town. The following weekend, I saw him again, this time at the campus park. He was sitting on a bench, his arm still in a sling and wearing that same warm smile. I recognized him instantly, and he seemed to recognize me too. "Hey, Claire, right?" he said, addressing me by name as if we were old friends. There was something comforting in his voice, and I felt at ease chatting with him. He asked about my weekend plans, mentioned a new cafe in town, and suggested I check it out sometime. It was an indirect but courteous invitation that, in a strange way, made me feel special. What I didn't know, as he looked at me with those seemingly genuine eyes, was that I was standing in the presence of a predator. As the days passed, the disappearances became more frequent. News of young women vanishing spread through local papers, and fear began to ripple across the campus. That was when I started noticing that the man with the warm smile always seemed to be around, at campus events, in places I frequented, always within view. The world, which had once felt so safe, was starting to feel suffocating. The puzzle pieces were still disconnected, but my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. At that moment, I had no idea I was face to face with Ted Bundy, the predator who would turn our tranquil campus into the backdrop of a nightmare. After that casual encounter at the park, the image of that man began to linger in my mind more often. He seemed to be everywhere, at the library, in the dining hall, even in the hallway of the building where I had classes. Always polite, always friendly, yet something about his behavior made me uneasy. The news of disappearances continued to grow. More names appeared in the local papers, and the descriptions of the missing young women shared a troubling pattern. College-aged, last seen in public places, with no signs of struggle or clear evidence about what had happened to them. The campus, once a safe and vibrant space, now seemed shrouded in shadows. One night, while reviewing notes for an upcoming exam, I heard footsteps echoing in the hallway of my building. It was almost 10 p.m., and the usual campus bustle had quieted. My heart quickened when I heard a faint knock on my door. Hesitating for a moment, I finally asked, "Who is it?" "It's Ted, from the park. Are you okay?" His voice was unmistakable. My first reaction was discomfort. How did he know where I lived? My pulse raced as I approached the door but didn't open it. "How do you know where I live?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though the fear was evident in my voice. "Oh, I just asked around," he replied casually. "People mentioned you lived in this building. I just wanted to check if you'd like some company while studying." I declined with a rushed excuse, saying I was busy and needed to focus on my work. He insisted a couple of times, but eventually gave up and left. I listened as his footsteps faded down the hallway, but I stayed awake for hours, unable to shake the anxiety. The next morning, the unease still lingered. I shared what had happened with Lisa, who was visibly alarmed. "That's not normal, Claire. He shouldn't know where you live." She was right, of course. But how could I prove he was doing anything wrong? He seemed so ordinary, so polite, so normal. The following days were a blur of paranoia and attempts to maintain my routine. I became more cautious, avoiding isolated areas and making sure I was never alone when walking. But what happened the following weekend confirmed that something was deeply wrong. I had decided to visit a library in the neighboring town for some peace and quiet. It was a space few people from campus frequented, and I thought it would give me a break from my growing unease. Immersed in my books, I didn't notice the sun setting until the building began to empty out. When I finally looked up, the library was nearly deserted. As I gathered my things, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. My stomach churned as I turned to see Ted standing a few meters away, wearing that same unsettling smile. "Claire, what a coincidence running into you here." Coincidence? It was impossible. In that moment, I knew he had followed me. I was just leaving, Ted. I need to go, I said, trying to keep my composure as I slung my bag over my shoulder. He stepped forward, blocking the corridor exit. Why are you always avoiding me? I just want to be your friend. His tone shifted, becoming more aggressive, more urgent. My heart was pounding and survival instincts took over. Please let me pass. When he took another step closer, I gripped my bag tightly and bolted down the opposite corridor. He shouted something after me, but I didn't stop to listen. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, bursting out through the emergency exit. That night, once I was safely home, I went straight to the police. I recounted everything, the chance meetings, how he seemed to know my routines, and how he had followed me to the library. They took my statement, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. It wasn't until weeks later that the name Ted Bundy began to dominate the headlines. He had been arrested on suspicion of multiple murders, and the number of missing women linked to him left the nation in shock. When I saw his face in the papers, my blood ran cold. The polite, charismatic man I had met was nothing more than a monster hiding behind a smile. I was one of the lucky ones, one of the ones who got away. Even now, thinking back to those encounters sends a chill down my spine. Ted Bundy was a predator, and the world realized the truth about him far too late. Milwaukee had always been a quiet city, at least in the neighborhood where I lived. The tree-lined streets and reserved, cordial residents gave the area a sense of calm. My building was a modest 3-story complex with walls thin enough to hear the neighbor's TV and the footsteps in the hallway. That summer, a new tenant moved into the apartment next to mine. He seemed shy and unassuming, a thin man with blonde hair and large glasses that gave him a studious air. I first saw him carrying a heavy box into the building. I offered to help, but he simply shook his head and muttered, "Thanks, but I can manage." I didn't know much about him except that his name was Jeffrey. He rarely spoke to the other residents, but would offer a quick nod or polite smile in passing. One evening, while I was watching TV, a strange smell wafted into the hallway. It was strong, unpleasant, almost chemical, yet mixed with something putrid. It bothered me, but I chalked it up to old plumbing. The building wasn't new after all. The next day, the smell was even stronger. I ran into Jeffrey in the hallway as I was heading to work. Trying to be polite, I brought it up. "Hey, are you noticing that strange smell? It's like something died around here." He paused, looked at me with that blank smile and said, "Oh yeah. It's probably some meat that spoiled in my freezer. The thing stopped working and I haven't had time to fix it." It seemed like a reasonable explanation, so I nodded and went on my way. As weeks passed, the smell persisted and whispers began spreading among the tenants. People were complaining about the same odor, but no one could pinpoint its source. Some speculated it was a sewage issue in the building. At night, I began hearing odd sounds coming from Jeffrey's apartment. They weren't loud, but were unsettling nonetheless. Muffled thuds, something being dragged, a rhythmic hammering that seemed to come from the floor, and occasionally a low, anguished noise that could have been mistaken for an injured animal. One afternoon in the building's laundry room, I bumped into Glenda, the tenant who lived across from Jeffrey. She looked agitated, so I asked if everything was okay. "No, it's not," she replied, arms crossed tightly. "Something's wrong with that man." I asked her what she meant, and she explained that she too heard noises at night. But what disturbed her most was how often Jeffrey brought people over to his apartment. "They're always young men," she said, her voice lowering, "and they never stay long." That revelation unsettled me. While it wasn't unusual for private people to have discreet social lives, something in Glenda's tone made me pay closer attention. That night I couldn't sleep. As I lay in bed, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway and the faint sound of running water from Jeffrey's apartment. My gut told me something was wrong. The next morning, while I was having coffee, there was a knock at my door. It was Glenda again, her expression even more worried. "I called the police," she said. "Something's not right in that apartment." I asked what she'd seen, and she told me that earlier that morning, she had watched Jeffrey take large black garbage bags to the dumpster behind the building. "He's hiding something," she whispered. Hours later, the police arrived. What started as a quiet investigation quickly turned into a public nightmare. I watched from my window as officers entered Jeffrey's apartment. Minutes turned to hours and more squad cars arrived. Something terrible had been uncovered. When the police finally emerged, Jeffrey was in handcuffs, his head hanging low as they escorted him out. At the time, I didn't know what to think, but the looks on the officers' faces said it all. Whatever was inside his apartment was something no one would ever forget. What came next would shock the entire world. Chaos engulfed the neighborhood the following morning. The building was surrounded by police cars, reporters, and curious onlookers. I could barely comprehend that the reserved, polite man who lived next door had been arrested for something so horrific. Nobody knew for certain what the police had found in Jeffrey's apartment, but rumors began spreading like wildfire. I tried to carry on with my routine, but the atmosphere was heavy. The sounds and smells that had once seemed like minor nuisances now felt sinister. Every memory of what happened in that apartment next door was suddenly drenched in a terrifying new context. That afternoon, I watched the news while sipping my coffee. The anchor, with a grave expression, began detailing the case that was shocking Milwaukee. It was then that I first heard the horrifying extent of what had been hidden behind Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment door. The reporter explained that inside the apartment, police had discovered gruesome evidence: human remains stored in plastic bags in the freezer, bones meticulously stacked in one corner, and surgical tools used to dissect bodies. The smell, that unmistakable stench all of us had complained about, was the result of bodies being stored and manipulated in ways that defied comprehension. I couldn't finish my coffee. The thought that all of this had happened so close to me made my stomach churn. Days later, residents were allowed back into the building to collect their belongings, but many, like Glenda, decided to move out immediately. When she knocked on my door to say goodbye, she looked more relieved than sad. "I knew there was something wrong with that man," she said, "but I never imagined it was something like this." I considered moving too, but something held me back. Perhaps it was a morbid curiosity to understand how someone so seemingly ordinary could harbor such monstrous secrets. As the days passed, more details about the case emerged. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a murderer. He was a calculated predator. He lured vulnerable young men to his apartment with promises of drinks or photography, drugged them, and committed unspeakable acts. More than a dozen victims were discovered in his apartment or identified through witness reports. Among the most horrifying revelations was the fact that Dahmer had practiced cannibalism. This transformed the case from merely gruesome to incomprehensibly macabre. The following months were a blur of interviews, court proceedings, and headlines. Jeffrey Dahmer became one of the most infamous names in American history. His detailed confessions and the coldness with which he described his crimes left the world in stunned disbelief. For me, the experience changed everything. I began questioning everyone around me, doubting neighbors, and realizing that evil could be lurking where we least expect it. One day, while walking down the hallway, I stopped in front of Jeffrey's apartment. The door was sealed shut, but the emptiness and darkness within felt almost tangible. It was impossible to imagine what those walls had witnessed. Today, years later, that summer remains etched in my memory. The vacant stare of Jeffrey Dahmer, the foul stench that lingered through the building, the strange noises that haunted quiet nights, all of it is a part of a past I can never erase. The world knows Jeffrey Dahmer as the Milwaukee Cannibal. To me, he'll always be the strange man in the apartment next door, a haunting reminder that monsters are sometimes closer than we realize. The first time I saw John Wayne Gacy was at a community event in our town park. Dressed as Pogo the Clown, his perfectly painted face and exaggerated smile drew both children and adults toward him. It was a sunny day filled with laughter and music, but something about his presence made me uneasy. It wasn't the makeup, which seemed unnervingly taut, or his gaze, which lingered a little too long during casual interactions. It was an inexplicable feeling, like a chill down my spine with no discernible cause. I lived in a quiet suburb just outside Chicago. Our community was small and close-knit, far removed, so we thought, from the tragedies that made the evening news. Gacy was a well-known figure in the area. respected as a businessman and community organizer. He owned a construction company which gave him access to various homes and workspaces in the neighborhood. Beyond that, he went out of his way to present himself as a pillar of the community, frequently volunteering at events and even hosting gatherings at his own home. At a neighborhood barbecue one afternoon, I overheard a group of adults praising Gacy as a golden guy. He employed local teenagers, paid well, and seemed genuinely invested in helping people succeed. But I noticed a pattern. The young men who worked for him rarely stayed employed for long. "They're just irresponsible kids," someone said dismissively. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But later, that memory would take on a far darker meaning. One incident, however, has stayed with me vividly. It was late, and I was walking home from a night shift at the restaurant where I worked. My house was on the same street as Gacy's, and as I passed by, I noticed lights on in his garage. The door was slightly ajar, and inside he stood with his back to me, seemingly arranging something on the floor. What caught my attention was an odd mannequin lying on the ground, partially covered by a tarp. Only its feet were visible, but they looked disturbingly lifelike. I shook the thought away. After all, who would do something suspicious with their garage door wide open? Weeks went by and rumors began circulating about missing boys. They were local teenagers, mostly between the ages of 15 and 21. Students, part-time workers, kids from good families. People whispered, trying to connect the disappearances, but the authorities always seemed one step behind. One evening, at a dinner gathering with friends, someone casually mentioned Gacy. "He just hired my cousin's son recently," a woman at the table said, "but the kid quit after 2 weeks, said he didn't like the atmosphere." That's when one of the men shared something that caught my attention. He mentioned that Gacy had a reputation for being intense and seemed far more interested in befriending young men than interacting with adults. "He's got a controlling personality," the man said. The conversation moved on, but that comment stuck with me. The disappearances continued. Our once safe community grew anxious. Neighbors began locking doors and windows, something we'd rarely done before. Smiles faded and casual exchanges were tinged with unease. Yet Gacy remained untouched, his easy grin and friendly demeanor intact. He continued hosting events, appearing as Pogo the Clown, handing out balloons and laughter. If anyone suspected him, they didn't dare voice it aloud. But something in the back of my mind began piecing things together. The lights in the garage, the mannequin, the young men who seemed to orbit Gacy and then vanish. It couldn't be, I thought. Who would do something so monstrous? Little did I know the man in the clown suit with his exaggerated smile was harboring a darkness that would soon shock not just our community, but the entire world. The clown who hid a nightmare. The silence of the morning was shattered by the wail of sirens and the buzz of frantic voices. I woke to the sound of police cars lining the street, their red and blue lights reflecting eerily through my windows. The center of the chaos was John Wayne Gacy's house. Officers swarmed the property, speaking in hushed yet urgent tones as they glanced toward the garage and backyard. I stood on my porch, trying to piece together what was happening while other neighbors did the same. For years, Gacy had worn a mask of normalcy. He was the life of the party, the reliable friend, and the successful businessman. No one could have imagined the horrors he had been hiding mere feet from where we lived our ordinary lives. That morning, his secrets began to surface, literally. Days earlier, an investigation had been launched after police linked the disappearance of a young man named Robert Peast to Gacy. Robert had vanished after telling his mother he was meeting with a local businessman to discuss a job. When authorities questioned Gacy, his story didn't add up. Witnesses placed him near the location where Robert was last seen, giving investigators enough reason to obtain a search warrant for his home. As officers scoured the property, whispers began circulating through the neighborhood. They found something in his garage, one neighbor said, visibly shaken. Another mentioned having heard about strange smells coming from Gacy's house, but admitted they hadn't thought much of it. It was hard to believe something so sinister could happen so close to home. By the end of the day, the first horrifying news broke. Police had discovered human remains buried beneath Gacy's house. Not just one or two bodies, many, The fragmented details were almost impossible to process. How had no one noticed something so monstrous? I recalled the nights I'd walked past his house and seen the garage lit up. I thought about the mannequin under the tarp. The realization that I might have seen signs of his crimes without recognizing them was unbearable. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. Police dug through the house's foundation and yard, unearthing a series of shallow graves. Each new discovery seemed worse than the last. More than 20 bodies were eventually recovered, most of them young men and boys who had gone missing over the years. The community was in shock, not just because of the victims, but because of how Gacy had manipulated everyone around him. He used his charm to lure young men with promises of jobs in his construction company. What seemed like an honest opportunity was, in reality, a deadly trap. News of the discoveries spread quickly, and Gacy's home became the focus of national attention. Television crews, journalists, and curious onlookers gathered on our street. It was chilling to realize that the man who had shaken our hands and smiled at our families was one of the most ruthless killers in American history. As the bodies were identified, each one carried a story of pain and loss. Families who had spent years without answers finally learned the fates of their loved ones, but the relief of closure was overshadowed by the horror of what they endured. Gacy was arrested, and during his trial the world saw a cold and calculating monster. He repeatedly denied his crimes, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. His demeanor alternated between calm and rational in outbursts of anger, revealing the manipulative nature that had allowed him to evade suspicion for so long. Years later, he was sentenced to death for his crimes. But for our community, the scars he left never truly healed. The street we once called home was forever changed. Gacy's house was demolished, as if to erase the memories of what had transpired there. Still, no one could forget the exaggerated smile of Pogo the Clown, now a symbol of something far darker. Gacy's life served as a grim reminder. Sometimes monsters don't hide in the shadows. They live among us, wearing the guise of normality.